Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Please bear with us a few moments as we let everybody in from the waiting room. That will take 10, 20 seconds, and then we will get going. Thank you for joining us today.
Good day. I am Paul Peterson. I'm the director of the program on education policy and governance at the Harvard Kennedy School. Welcome to our 5th session in this series on the post-pandemic future of homeschooling. This session, like all of our sessions, is being recorded and will soon be available on our website. You can see all the previous sessions. Automatic captioning is available today if you just sort of click on at the bottom of your screen. It's also available on the recorded versions of the webinar. So today we look at the research on child abuse in homeschool and traditional school settings. Those who would monitor homeschooling more closely highlight potential of child abuse as one of the reasons for tight regulation. Homeschoolers themselves say existing laws on child abuse are quite sufficient. Well, what does the empirical evidence say? Do we have child abuse in homeschooling settings? Is it any more frequent there than ever? What's happening in our traditional school settings? So we don't have an answer one way or another to these questions. We do have research that bears on these questions, and that's the focus of our conversation today. I want to thank Antonio Wentland, Michael Poore, and Nick Tavares for their help preparing the conference. And I'm especially appreciative of Daniel Hammond, a professor at the University of Oklahoma, who's played such an important role in the organization of this conference. And Daniel is going to introduce the participants today. Daniel? Daniel, are you connected? Otherwise, I will introduce the presenters. For our session today, we have 2 scholars who have done extensive research on child and sexual abuse, as well as an expert commentator who studies the politics of K-12 education in the United States. Our first presenter is Dr. Carol Shakeshaft. She is professor of educational leadership at the Virginia Commonwealth University School of Education. She has previously published research on the sexual abuse of children by adults in public schools, and that is her topic for today. Our second presenter is Dr. Angela Dillis. She is the professor of regional economic development at Western Carolina University. She works on a range of issues in education, including school choice and homeschooling, and has done work on this topic of child abuse and homeschooling, which she will report on today. So our commentator is my good friend, Dr. Martin West, who's the William Henry Bloomberg Professor of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He's also the Deputy Director of the Program on Education Policy and Governance and Editor-in-Chief of Education Next. As our note to our audience, you will see the panelists, but members of the audience are not visible. You should feel free to post your questions to the panelists using the Q&A function in Zoom, but we ask you to pose succinct questions. We also, in the chat function, if you don't want to follow the chat, just hit the chat button and you can turn it off, although it will pop up at the bottom of the screen. So if you don't want to pay any attention to chatting, just ignore it. That's what I do most of the time, is ignore chatting so I can focus on what the presenters actually have to say. So let's get started then, Cheryl. I turn it over to you first. Please unmute yourself. You need to unmute yourself, Cheryl, otherwise we won't be able to hear you.
Oh, did Did we just lose Cheryl by chance?
I think what we will do is we will try to work that out with Cheryl, and we'll start with Angela first. Angela, can you present your paper first?
Sure. Well, except that's not my paper. Here we go. All right. Thank you, Professor Hamlin, Professor Peterson. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat today. I'm going to just see if I can minimize you guys real quick. There we go. I started this project about a year ago after listening to the controversy over Professor Bartholet's Arizona Law Review piece, arguments that I think a lot of us heard earlier in the conference. And her concern is a concern with child maltreatment. She argues that the current ease with which parents can educate their children at home, quote, poses real dangers to children and to society. And that these dangers include child maltreatment, such as physical abuse and neglect, and that neglect can also include educational neglect. She's concerned that homeschooling permits abusive parents to isolate their children from the oversight of the mandatory reporters in public schools. Homeschool supporters point out that public schools also fail to provide a 100% safe environment. Many children experience sexual misconduct from educators, as we'll hear from Professor Shakeshaft, as well as bullying, assault, and other violence during their K-12 careers. I look forward to hearing some of the evidence that she will share briefly. Parental concerns about school climate and safety are in fact a primary reason that many families homeschool. But Professor Shakeshaft's not alone, Professor Bartholet, excuse me, is not alone in her concerns. A variety of states have also proposed, although none of them have successfully adopted, laws ranging from proposed background checks of parents before being allowed to homeschool, to quarterly home visits, or other mechanisms to try to provide more oversight to homeschooled children. So having some causal evidence on the effect of homeschooling on child safety is an important piece of this policy discussion. My researcher response to the debate was to try to figure out how we could learn more about the causal relationship, if any, between child safety and homeschooling. So this is how I approached the project. As far as I know, there's sort of not any empirical evidence on that specific question between homeschooling and overall violence experienced by children. There are some studies, and Brian Ray just emailed me some more this morning, so I have some more to look into. There are some studies that speak to one piece of this, which is violence in the form of child abuse. Note that child abuse, by definition, in most states occurs only at the hands of parents, guardians, or other primary caregivers. Certainly, this is the case in North Carolina, where I live. Both of these existing studies on homeschooling and child abuse use a database called the Homeschooling's Invisible Children. Both of them suggest possibly higher rates of child abuse fatalities among homeschooled children, although neither finds statistically significant evidence. The relationship in general appears rather weak. And as other panelists have discussed, there's fairly limited causal evidence on homeschooling. Going into this project, I have sort of two major concerns in trying to estimate a causal effect. One is that I need some exogenous variation in homeschooling, and I need some measure of child safety. With the important question that economists love to ask is we always have to think, when we're thinking about the effect of homeschooling, is compared to what? So let me talk briefly about both of those, how I'm trying to work with both of those concerns. So first, I need some factor that changes how prevalent homeschooling is, but is directly uncorrelated with rates of child safety. The approach I'm going to take is I'm going to rely on states' adoptions of homeschool rights legislation, laws that were primarily adopted in the 1980s and 1990s. And what they did was clarify the legal status of homeschooling in each state. There's a paper by Roshana Bhatt in 2014 in the Journal of School Choice, where she shows that these laws increase the prevalence of homeschooling, at least among those aged 5 to 8 years old. To give you a sense of those laws, the laws that are in my sample are here. Most of these states adopt their laws during the 1980s. There's a few that happen in the 1990s as well. So the empirical benefit of these laws is that they're plausibly exogenous. If I just use data on homeschool prevalence from the states where I can measure it, well, one, we may be concerned that prevalence isn't well measured. And two, the estimated effect on homeschooling on child safety is likely to be biased given the potential for in both endogeneity and reverse causality. So I'm going to estimate the effects of these laws, of these homeschool rights legislation rules on measures of child safety. So many thanks to Mike Donnelly for sharing his data and for chatting with me about some of the background behind them. The second thing I need to do is I need to measure child safety, and I need to do so in the 1980s and 1990s when these laws were passed. So in the end, I'm going to use 3 measures of child safety. My preferred measure is to look at violent deaths. I'm going to use violent deaths of 5 to 9-year-olds and 10 to 14-year-olds, so younger school-aged children. Violent deaths here include deaths due to accidental causes, all accidental causes except for traffic fatalities, as well as homicides and suicides. So accidental causes of death may be related to neglect. A child may drown or fall off a ladder due to parental neglect, or they may be related to abuse. Physical harm to a child may be presented to a medical provider as an accident. Physical harm to a child, regardless of the perpetrator, a parent, an educator, a community member, or another child, may be coded as a homicide. And I include suicides because previous research demonstrates that violence of all types worsens mental health and may increase deaths by suicide. So some advantages of looking at violent deaths are that deaths are well measured. No one makes a qualitative decision, such as with a case of neglect or abuse, where a degree might matter in reporting, as well as in determining whether an abuse case is substantiated. Also, deaths measure this overall trade-off. They capture harms perpetrated by parents and educators and peers. Few children, however, die a violent death in any given state and in any given year. So obviously that's a good thing, but with few deaths, that means there's less variation over time and across states to explain. In addition, these deaths capture both too much. They capture deaths occurring in one's community that may be unrelated to schooling choice, and they capture too little by omitting a wide variety of non-fatal violence experienced by children, including assaults, non-fatal abuse, and bullying. So I'm also going to use 2 other measures. Both of these measures are from the National Data Archive on Child Abuse and Neglect. Indican began collecting data in 1990. So I'm going to use data from 1990 to 2008. One advantage of these measures is they speak directly to policymakers and advocates for restriction spheres. One disadvantage is that child maltreatment in many states only captures one side of the story, harm from parents and primary caregivers. So child maltreatment rates only capture if children switch from institutional schooling to more homeschooling, those child maltreatment rates capture only any possible effect of spending more time with their families and not the effect of spending less time in an institutional schooling situation. Most cases of child maltreatment are of neglect. So, and the bar for what constitutes neglect may change over time and across states. So that's also an empirical concern. Another disadvantage is that child maltreatment cases rely on reporting. Restriction supporters argue that because teachers are mandatory reporters, any observed decrease in child maltreatment due to increased homeschooling may not reflect an actual decrease in rates of maltreatment, but only a decline in maltreatment cases being brought to the attention of the authorities. On the other hand, increases in homeschooling rates may build larger communities of homeschooling, exposing children to wider varieties of adults other than teachers and parents who may also report any suspected child abuse. So I'm going to estimate, I can't help myself, there's equations. I'm going to estimate 2-way fixed effects models. There I have year fixed effects. They control for any common national trends in the outcome variable in these measures of child safety. I control for state fixed effects. They control for time invariant differences across states. And then I include controls for a wide variety of other factors that previous research demonstrates are correlated with rates of child safety, including economic and demographic characteristics, as well as a variety of alcohol and drug laws. Effectively, what two-way fixed effects does is I'm going to compare child safety rates in states with and without the homeschool rights legislation before and after the adoption of the homeschool rights legislation. And the idea is that we can then isolate that effect of homeschool rights legislation, and so any effect of increased homeschooling on the measure of child safety. To summarize my results, what I find is fairly consistent across a variety of specifications. Most of the estimated effects are statistically insignificant. I observed very slightly higher rates of violent deaths following the adoption of homeschool rights, although again, those differences are not statistically significant. Estimates using the child maltreatment data are somewhat contradictory, so I show a significant decline in fatalities due to child maltreatment and a significant increase in reported child maltreatment cases. However, neither of these results, neither that decline in fatalities nor the increase in child maltreatment, are robust to some standard empirical checks, which I'm not going to get into some details, but I do some fairly standard things like event study estimates and Goodman-Bacon decomposition, both of which are particularly important in this context, given the differential timing in homeschool rights adoption across states and the differing sample periods. And effectively, what I find with those are no significant effects in the event study and an average of roughly 0 effects when I decompose it in the different kinds of treatment groups. I also look specifically at whether there's a change in reporter type following homeschool rights. So one of the things INDICAN provides is who reported the suspected abuse, and I find no statistically significant or large changes in reporter type. Overall, the picture is one of little to no effect of homeschool rights on child safety. Whether proposals to restrict homeschooling are likely to improve child safety depends on at least 2 things: whether homeschooling reduces child safety and whether the stated requirements actually improve child safety. My estimates suggest that there's little causal evidence for the former. Whether additional regulation of homeschooling is likely to improve child safety is also unclear. Existing laws prohibit child maltreatment as well as assault, rape, and homicide by non-caregivers. Relying on school employees as mandatory reporters when in many cases they simply aren't reporting their own colleagues for their sexual misconduct seems fairly ineffective. And evidence on, for example, home visits for infants show somewhat mixed effects on outcomes of child abuse and neglect. We may have other concerns with oversight of homeschooling, such as concerns for parental rights, disparate enforcement of laws against families of color or non-mainstream religious groups, effects of homeschooling on other outcomes, and the like are all going to affect sort of any cost-benefit analysis of additional regulation. So thank you for your time today, and thank you to Professor West for his comments.
Daniel, you
Cheryl, you're up next.
Okay, let me just share my screen. I'm assuming you're seeing my shared screen. Hi, I'm Cheryl Shakeshaft. I'm kind of extraneous in a way to this conversation since I study public schools and independent schools, but for the past 30 years, I've studied sexual abuse by school employees in independent and public schools. Within the public school realm, as you heard before, about 9.6% of all students in grades 8 through 11 report some kind of contact or non-contact educator sexual misconduct that was unwanted. And I will come back to that about in terms of studying the issues here. Some report only non-contact, some report contact. Non-contact would be things like using social media and transferring pictures, nude pictures, taking videos without touching the student, masturbating in front of a student, but also using language that is sexually charged and discusses sexual issues. Contact is anything in which there's a physical contact. So what that means is in schools today, if we take this study, about 5.6 million students, public and independent school students, are subject to school employee sexual misconduct sometime between kindergarten and 12th grade, which is what these studies report. These studies that I'm reporting on are old studies. The last data was collected in 2002. There have been no national studies, not even any regional studies since then that have collected data that would update us about the prevalence of school employee sexual misconduct towards students. So the answer to the issue of, what do we know and how much light can be shed on it starts first with it isn't just within the homeschooling community where there is maybe a data lack. There's a data lack in the public and independent schools. There's no reason to believe from the number of reports that have happened in terms of reports to police and others that sexual abuse by school employees has decreased. On the other hand, we just don't know because we don't have that data. Some people think it's probably increased. I think that's probably a function of better reporting and better understanding of what's going on in schools. Dr. Deals presented the data that is in a couple of my earlier slides that for some reason my clicking on my my PowerPoint just jumped over about what we know about anything in homeschooling situations. And what I would say is that based upon what I know about schools and what happens in schools, and from what I've read about homeschooling and what happens, it's highly unlikely that there's a higher incidence of sexual abuse of kids in the homeschooling world than in the public school world. But again, I can't substantiate that through great data sets because we just don't have those data. But my research on schools and predators and cases over the years have looked very closely at the patterns and how it happens. What I will say, for instance, is of predators in schools, many of them have children. And it's very rare that they sexually abuse their own children. So that is something that turns up in the data that we find, even when that's investigated. So what I would say is that we don't know the number of adults in schools who sexually abuse kids. We have no data on that. We only know cases. So it may be that someone has sexually abused one child. It may be they've sexually abused 20 children. So we don't have that data either. But we do know where the environment where it occurs. And what I wanted to do is just take a few minutes to say how I think this might work, might be useful for understanding in the world of homeschooling and particularly in sort of hybrid homeschooling. So the factors that relate to whether or not an adult sexually abuses a child in schools have to do with really four areas. One is internal inhibitors. If the person is afraid of getting caught, has a moral sense that even though they want to do this, they can't do this, that can overcome the action that they might take. So anything that reinforces shared values against sexual abuse of children will help. Anything externally that inhibits a person who might cross a line, boundary cross with children. So rules, working in a place where they can be observed, shared cultures and expectations of what's appropriate and what's inappropriate for an adult behavior toward a child. And I say this because very often in hybrid situations, children are in a mathletes group, or they're in an art group, or they're in a music group. So there's not necessarily that they're with their parents, they're in other groups in other places with adults who aren't the parents. And so that is the same kind of situation that happens in a public or an independent school, i.e. a teacher. And so the same kinds of inhibitors like policies and expectations and understanding of appropriate and inappropriate boundaries between adults and students help to inhibit that any behavior that could lead to sexual abuse of a kid. Opportunity to engage in an activity. When an adult is alone with a child with no supervision, no open door, no way that somebody's going to walk in, step in, that makes it a more dangerous situation. When an adult has access to a child through cell phone, through private apps, through a private texting, through something that has no way to monitor or for a parent to check in, that is an issue. And that's a way that grooming occurs. And then the ability to overcome resistance. So people who are going to sexually abuse, so I'm looking not so much at parents here because that's a whole different issue in terms of resistance, but people who might be running a hybrid activity for kids, and if they were, might be likely to cross boundaries with a child, they need to overcome resistance. So the way they do that is to make sure that that you trust them, that the parent trusts them, that the child trusts them, that they're very important to the child. They give the child things, whether it's attention or instruction or other things, and they support the parents. And so understanding how grooming works in these situations would be useful in a hybrid homeschool situation. And so basically grooming works through providing special favors, providing access, providing sports support, providing musical support, providing things beyond what parents can provide in an isolated or individualistic place. Not everybody who does these things is grooming, but that is how grooming and where grooming occurs. So in order to be able to groom a child for trust, you groom the parents for trust. And also trips and presents and food, extra activities. Those are all ways that, whether it's a Boy Scout troop or a Boys and Girls Club or a school or a private music group, those are the ways that people who are predators or who might sexually abuse kids, that's the way that they do it. So understanding those issues out in terms of thinking about homeschooling as a hybrid activity where it is might be a useful way to do that. So I was thinking that probably the most important part in terms of my taking up your time of this was the discussion that we might have. So I've tried to keep this short. I have a paper and anyone who wants it can have it. And the slides that I have will be posted. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. Cheryl, quick question for you. So the numbers that you presented are alarming, much higher than I would have anticipated. Do you know why there are no national data sets anymore? What happened with those data, if there are plans to start collecting them again?
Well, the only data that were collected by the American Association of University Women for a whole nother study. They were studying peer sexual harassment in schools. And so they asked kids, the studies are really quite sound. They're survey studies, but they asked kids, they had a nationwide, really well-defined sample. They did this study twice over a period of different years. And they asked kids, basically, has anyone ever done this to you? And they would have an example in school when you didn't want them to. And the reason it said when you didn't want them to is because if you're talking about peer sexual abuse, child to child or adult to adult, but peer sexual abuse, the definition of sexual harassment in that case is unwanted, something you didn't want. So kids answered, but what they also then it would say, if they said yes, then there was a whole series of questions, and one of the questions was who, and there were roles, and that's where the information about the prevalence of adults to students came out. So it wasn't the original intent of the study to study adult to student sexual misconduct, but because kids said, yes, this has happened to me when I didn't want it to, and it was my coach, it was my teacher, it was whatever, that's where we got those data. So I can't tell you why we don't study this. What I will tell you is that I have submitted any number of grant proposals to study this, and it may be because I'm just a crappy grant writer, but it could also be based in some of the responses I get, which often, not often, every single time I've done this, one of the reviewers' responses says this: only 10% of, this only happens to 10% of students. This is not a very big problem. I don't see why we would study this. So I think it has to do with the will. will of what people want to know, will of what people in powerful positions want to happen, will of what schools want out. And so I do think there's that plays into it. I believe that schools, that the regulations and the procedures of schools are made for the convenience of adults, not the best world for children. And for many adults, it's most convenient not to look at these things rather than to look at them.
Thank you, Cheryl. And now we'll turn it over to our commentator, Dr. West.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. Thanks for the great presentations, Angela and Carol. So the question posed in the title of today's session is child abuse greater at school or homeschool? And the motivation for asking that question is obvious. This insinuation that the incidence of child abuse is greater among homeschooling families is frequently used to justify regulatory proposals that homeschooling families find intrusive. And Angela mentioned the most prominent recent version of that with Elizabeth Bartolet's diagnosis, first, that homeschooling in its current unregulated form poses serious risks of abuse and neglect. And that diagnosis led her to prescribe a radical transformation in the homeschooling regime, she wrote, including a presumptive ban on homeschooling with the burden on parents to demonstrate justification for permission to homeschool. So I certainly understand the reason for posing the question, but I don't actually think it's exactly the most useful question to ask for policy purposes. One reason is that it turns out to be impossible to answer. And in the paper that was behind the presentation that you heard from Carol just now, she focuses in on the issue of sexual abuse in particular and really makes an authoritative case that we don't even know how common it really is in public school settings, let alone among homeschoolers. It's not that we don't know anything about the topic. Her description of common patterns of abuse are very helpful to all parents in knowing what to look for when their child is involved in youth-serving organizations outside of their direct supervision. But this lack of clear definitions, lack of data collection, and even more fundamentally, selective reporting in the data that we do get makes pinning down precise rates of abuse and trends over time exceptionally difficult. The second reason I don't think the question posed in the session title is exactly right, though, is that the relative incidence of abuse at school versus in homeschools doesn't tell us much, if anything, about how permitting or even encouraging homeschooling affects the overall number of students who experience abuse. And that's what we really want to know from a policy perspective. And Angela's paper provides a partial window, at least, on that question. So she looks back at this period when states were adopting more permissive homeschooling right laws, and she compares the states that, she asks how the adoption of those laws in the 1980s affected the incidence of violent deaths and reports of child abuse among children in the states that made this change. We know from prior research that these laws led to more homeschooling, so this allows her to ask whether that increase in homeschooling leads to changes in abuse. And she has a standard difference in differences research design, perhaps the most common research design used in econometric policy analysis. It's also a design where there's been fascinatingly considerable methodological innovation very recently. And so one of my comments she anticipated by adding what's known as a Goodman-Bacon decomposition to pin down exactly the policy parameter that she's estimating. And so I was excited to see that addition to the paper. But I think the real challenge with the analysis is an issue of limited statistical power, or the ability to detect results as statistically significant, even if in fact they exist. And unfortunately, even quite large effects, quite tragic effects, given the nature of the outcomes that we're studying, would turn out to be statistically insignificant given the uncertainty around the estimates reported in the paper. And I'm not entirely sure what to do with that, given that we only have 50 states, and that limitation is the real challenge facing a lot of these cross-state comparisons. But it is the case that there's not a clear pattern in the evidence, the estimates that she's getting across these different measures, and perhaps we can learn at least a bit from that. But since I don't really see a way to generate an answer to a confident answer to this question of whether abuse is higher in school or in homeschool, or really either whether more permissive homeschooling regulation has led to an increase in abuse, let me propose that we might focus some of our conversation at least on a slightly different question, which is child abuse as rare as possible in each of the various settings in which students are educated? Or are there steps that we could take that would reduce the risk of child abuse without unduly infringing on families' educational choices? That is, just because the incidence of severe child abuse may well be lower among students educated at home, as I suspect that it is, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't consider reasonable steps that could drive it even lower, and in the process disarm critiques of homeschooling that place that concern front and center. And so in that context, I'd actually like to return to a proposal that was floated by homeschooling researcher Eric Warren in the very first session of this conference, but went undiscussed in the conversation that followed. He suggested the idea that one or perhaps two non-related mandatory reporters, like a pediatrician, might be asked to sign off that they've seen a kid and that he seems okay when that child is educated at home. He distinguished this from mandatory home visits, which he, and I share that concern, would find excessive. I would emphasize that school officials, despite the fact that they are mandatory reporters, shouldn't be involved or shouldn't be required to be involved in any regulatory scheme along those lines. But, and I'm sure there are flaws and concerns with the idea as I've put it forward here, but I wonder if it might be useful to think about, just as Carol's research motivates or should motivate efforts to reduce the incidence of sexual abuse in school settings, why we can't have a similar parallel conversation about what we can do in the homeschooling sector. So I will stop there and thank both presenters for the opportunity to learn from their work and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Marty. Paul, do you have a question, or?
Why don't we let each of the presenters respond to Marty's comments? So Angela, do you have any observations?
Thank you for your comments, Marty. I agree. I've been tracking some of the differences, econometrics advances over the past several years. And that's a lot of what I expect to spend my summer doing. But certainly part of my issue is a power problem. And I think it's probably worth, sort of the note I made here is it's probably worth me putting some bounds on how big the effects could be to give, or in either direction, just to sort of provide those upper and lower bounds of what we might be talking about in terms of the magnitude. I think that's a helpful piece of the discussion. So thank you though for your comment.
But my reaction to that comment was, well, since you're finding your results are all over the map, my guess is there's probably not much there. If you can't find it, and you've been about as thorough as you can be. Yeah, it would be nice to have more statistical power, but is that likely to produce a different result? And I don't see anything in your data that's convincing me that there's some undetected impact. And I also feel this way about your presentation, because it relates to one of the questions that was raised is, well, the issue is not, is there more abuse in the public schools? But the question is, does regulation of homeschooling reduce abuse? Because that's what's been proposed out there, is more intensive regulation. And certainly it doesn't sound as if changes in permissiveness of the legislation, at least to this point, maybe the idea that Marty has advanced about a check-in by a trained physician would make a big difference. But as of now, we don't see much evidence. Do you have any response to that?
So I think the one advantage to, assuming that, was that directed to me or to Cheryl?
Yes,
Sorry,
yes,
Paul.
to you, Angela. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
So I think, so one advantage of the design of the paper is that what I am looking at is a rule that made it easier for families to homeschool. So if really what you were doing were abusing your children and sort of outside of the, letter of the law, and going to do that anyways, then that probably was already happening prior to these homeschool rights legislation being passed. And those are not the children and families being affected. So I do think it helps to speak directly to that. I also think, particularly if you look at homeschoolers today, that most homeschoolers are interacting with a wide variety of adults in a wide variety of settings. And my experience is that, in any volunteer organization or religious institution, if you're working with children, you're required to go through, youth protection training, and there's a whole discussion about what that looks like. I think Cheryl has some comments about what that might, the risks with interacting with non-family adults, family members, adults, but I don't think for most homeschoolers that the issue is that they're unexposed to adults who might report severe cases of abuse and neglect.
Cheryl, do you have comments? Just unmute yourself.
I do. I can't see where regulation is going to help much. It hasn't helped much in public and independent schools, as far as we can tell. And it's the kind of regulations that are being proposed. I'm not clear how those would help, but remember, I'm only looking at a particular little narrow focus of sexual abuse of students and kids. What I would say is that education helps. And I think, as Angela and others have pointed out, and I probably used the wrong language, I'm looking at the chat and I apologize, but where homeschool children are in contact with people other than their parents, I think one of the issues is always just general education about appropriate adult to student interactions, what's appropriate, what's acceptable, whatever. That goes a long way for kids to understand and parents to understand and other kids to understand what's appropriate in groups they're in, at least in the area that I'm looking at. And that's not a regulation, that's, training about appropriate behaviors. But I don't see that we have a great track record in public schools of regulation that indicate that that would necessarily be an appropriate way to go about reducing harm to kids. What I would say is that in schools, everybody is fingerprinted, they have background checks, they do those things. None of those background checks ever turn up, or among professionals in schools, really hardly ever turn up somebody who has been accused or been found to sexually abuse a kid. So while they're there, they aren't a regulation that is really helping us to weed out people who might abuse or harm students.
Well, if I may ask a question of all the panelists, and it's in the Q&A, why don't we gather information on what is happening nationwide in a systematic way? We're gathering survey data on so many different topics. The government seems never to have asked this question, despite we've had so many government surveys reported on this very webinar series. Why isn't the government collecting this data? And one person raised, if the teacher unions are preventing this from happening. Could this be true? I'm going to ask Martin West that question first and then see if the rest of you have a response to that.
It certainly could be true. I think Carol offered some insight into this topic, though, because she suggested, I can assure you based on her paper, that her problem with generating funding for research on this topic is not that she doesn't know how to write grants. So I think there is something going on. I do think there are interest groups and the unions who would prefer that researchers focus their and statistical agencies focus their energies elsewhere. But I think what Carol pointed out, that there's a pull towards research topics that are seen as impacting all students rather than a much too large, but a relatively smaller subset. I think that dynamic, when you're competing for survey real estate and the space, probably plays a role as well.
Any other comments? Angela, what's your view on this? Is this lack of data on what's happening in general due to organized pressures to prevent such data collection?
I don't know that I'm going to comment on the teachers. I suspect that may play a role. So I have another piece I'm working on that sort of looks at how sort of unions tend, particularly public sector unions, are passing along their problem members in a way that makes them continue to be employable in other institutions without highlighting their misconduct. So I suspect that is part of the problem. I think another piece of the story, like if you look at a lot of the crime data or victim data, it's just harder to find data on children. And most of what we're focusing on, most of the abuse, as one of the commenters in the chat noted, is happening to younger than school-age children. Most of it's happening to infants and toddlers. And we just don't have good data on that. And I think it's a combination of, how hard is it to get IRB approval to ask children sensitive questions? If you're asking them as an adult and you're requiring them to remember correctly, and there's problems with that as well. And so some of them are sort of standard data problems that come from asking sensitive questions to young people. So,
Cheryl, you are the one who raised this question, but you ducked it. You did not say the causes why we don't have this important information. So come on, confess. What do you really think are the causes why we don't have needed information?
Well, I think A, we don't value children. B, I think we value adults more than children. And so we make adults feel comfortable over worrying about how to care for children. What I would say is that we have a lot of mechanisms. And in 2004, I did a report to the US Senate and looked at every possible data set that the government uses. I critiqued them for where we could add questions that they're collecting data on regularly in schools, where we could add questions that could track this. There's plenty of places that we could add these questions to data that's already collected by the government that would give us. So for instance, the US Office of Civil Rights collects data on how many kids are suspended, how many kids have this thing happen, how many kids do XYZ. They don't have questions about how many teachers allegations are brought against, or how many teachers are removed from service, or how many So all I'm trying to say is there's lots of ways to do this, to collect this data. That could be a regular data collection with adding just a few questions to already existing data collection data endeavors. And so, but there has to be a champion. There really has to be a champion. And I will say, and since you want confessionals, I know you didn't really, Paul, but I'm a Democrat. But trust me, not one of my Democrat leaders has been my helpmate here. The leaders who've been my helpmates have been conservative Republican leaders who hate teachers and schools. And so I'm a tool for them, for their purposes. But I'm certain Martin could give us a good lecture on the intersection of, how politics really works and how policy really works, and how we, don't look at the outcomes, not necessarily the intents. But what I'm saying is that my folks are beholden to teachers' unions as well as other things. And so this isn't maybe their favorite topic. So was that good enough, Paul? Have I bared my soul enough?
You've illuminated the topic. Daniel, do you have some questions?
You can't get much more candid than that. Thank you, Cheryl. I was wondering if we could return to, I think, Mari, you posed the question about doctor's visits and noted that it wasn't really discussed so much in the first session. And maybe we could return to that a little bit. So I think when that was mentioned, a lot of folks in our chat said, well, isn't this a guilty until proven innocent approach if we require this sort of thing? So maybe Angela, it sounds like you might have a comment on that. No, okay.
I mean, I agree with you. I think it's a guilty until proven innocent approach. I think that given the concerns we have about children's safety and institutional schooling, that needs to be, any rule that we have ought to be a rule that's uniformly applied. So what that looks like, I don't know, but it's not obvious to me, given the research, that more regulation is going to fix any perceived problem.
Yeah, I really just wanted to bring it back into the conversation because it was passed over so quickly. I can tell from the chat that a lot of people are not enthusiastic about the idea, and I expected certainly that would be the case. And let me say, after preparing the materials for this, reading the materials for this session, I'm much more energized by the potential to do good by doing more to prevent abuse of all kinds in public school settings than in the homeschooling community. I think that's a much greater problem. But when we don't, but I don't think we necessarily need to choose between those two things. And so I was trying to ask the question, are there approaches that would not interfere with families' ability to make educational choice that would nonetheless have the effect of surfacing and preventing a tragic, even if very rare outcome? And so that's the spirit of what I was trying to put on the table. And it may well be, I think, Paul, it's important to note that, we have to ask about a regulation, both whether it has any costs, but also whether it actually would yield any benefits, whether it would prevent any abuse that does occur under the banner of homeschooling. And I think it's worth thinking hard about both those. Another thought I had in preparing for this session was that I actually don't think it makes sense to talk about children being abused when in homeschooling. People don't homeschool. People who are abusing their child at home are not homeschooling the child. It's a very different phenomenon.
Yeah,
Right.
So, and that was a question I think one of our previous commentators brought up, was that really it's the use of the regulatory framework of homeschooling that people who are operating outside of the system are using or abusing, let's say. And so that was, this particular commentator was suggesting more regulation was needed, not necessarily to catch homeschoolers, but to catch those who really aren't homeschooling.
Correct. I think that's the right way to think about the concern. And the question is, can you find a way to do that without intruding on the rights of parents to make the decision?
One of the ideas that's occurred to me is there must be information in police files about abuse of children. And has anybody really worked with that data set, or why can't we work with that data set, or do we learn anything from that? So I'm surprised that nobody's brought up information from police files about changes or trends or whatever can be found there. So Cheryl, you probably have tried that option. So what have you learned?
Well, in police files, they code the data on either family member or other. And so you can know that if it's not somebody who is identified as a family member, but you can't know what their role was. Were they a neighbor? Were they a teacher? Were they clergy? So it doesn't give enough detail, at least for me to try to look at trends across different environments about where the abuse is occurring.
Angela, you, I'm sure, have tried to look at other data sets and you came up with a very clever idea. So what other clever ideas do you have to explore yet?
Well, so I think probably the next step for me is to sort of work through what the existing homeschool regulations look like, and unfortunately from an empirical standpoint, they haven't changed very much over the past many years. So I don't have a lot of variation to work with, but to sort of think about how more and less stringent regulations might be affecting these trends.
Well, how about the pandemic?
Abuse.
I mean, we have had a huge increase in homeschooling this past year. That experience should be generating some new information.
I agree. It'll be generating some new information. I think it's also going to sort of complicate the story significantly. We have a lot of people who are, monitoring their children's virtual schooling, and it's a very stressful time for families, and stress is sort of part of the predictors here for child abuse. And so I think that's going to complicate a lot of the story, at least from an empirical causal standpoint. But I think there'll be a lot of interesting variation to look at, certainly in terms of thinking about which schools went back sooner, who was home more, and sort of what that influence looks like. I don't know that it'll necessarily tell us a lot about homeschooling per se, as we need to untangle that who's homeschooling and who's has their children at home, but but I think there'll be a lot of interesting research to come out of it.
Angela, a lot of our attendees are wondering how to interpret your results. Are they correlational? Are they causal, or are they somewhere in between for folks out there who aren't very familiar with the diff and diff?
Yeah, so I'm making the argument that they're causal. Obviously, I have to convince the referees of that to get it published, but sort of the idea behind the empirical technique is to generate a causal estimate.
Yes.
So by controlling for a bunch of unobservable factors that differ across state or differ over time, and then a bunch of other features that we know are correlated with child abuse or violence towards children as well. So I'm making the case that it's causal. Brian Ray may disagree with me, but I still like.
Having read the paper, I would say it has a strong causal research design. The challenges are much less in that area and more have to do with power and measurement, right? And measurement is what I didn't get into as much, but there's a big difference between reported incidences of abuse and actual abuse. The fatalities data gets around that a little bit, but even there's different categories. And so those are the challenges.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to give everybody a final comment here. Cheryl, what do you have as your recommendation, your policy recommendation in conclusion?
Well, my policy recommendation would be that I don't think more regulation addresses this issue the way I've read the regulations and the way I understand the issue. I don't think there's evidence for that in the public schools and in other areas of society. It doesn't seem to me. I think Martin had some good ideas about other ways we might think safety, and I also think usefulness about teaching about boundaries is useful across the board. So just having people in homeschooling parents and others think about those ideas might be useful.
Yes, and Angela, your policy recommendation, number one policy.
Number one policy recommendation is no policy recommendation.
The researcher.
But perhaps as family and community members, we should all be aware of the children around us and the situations they're in. So.
And Marty, we'll give you the final word.
Give Carol a grant. We need to generate better information on this so that we can have a more informed conversation. I've already shared my other idea.
Well, I think this is really a very interesting panel that has illuminated an issue that I really was not sufficiently aware of. We just do not know enough about this topic, and we have not launched the data collection operations to even be able to describe things very well, much less come up with causes and explanations for things. And the first step in understanding anything is to know exactly what seems to be happening, to be able to describe things out there. So thank you all for joining us today for what I think was a very illuminating conversation.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you very much. And just
Thank
very
you.
quickly, next week we'll be reconvening at the same time and place to discuss homeschooling outside of the United States, and we'll be looking at international research on homeschooling, of course, and trends happening globally. We'll have researchers that will be talking about their work in France, Israel, and Canada. So we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye now.